Mount Everest. Why did you want to climb Mount Everest? Because it was there. Well, in a sense, Robert E. Lee presented something of the same challenge to me. And with that in view, I wanted to undertake this biography. Now, as it turned out, it actually became more of a challenge as time went on, because we went from 2013 and 2014, when I was originally designing the research project, through the 2017 Charlottesville riot, and then on from there into the various kinds of confrontations that resulted in statue removals, statue topplings, and so on like that. And talking about Robert E. Lee actually became more difficult as time went on. And finally, when the book was released in September of this year, there had actually been something of a question in my mind, which I put to my editor. And I said, is this really a good time for a biography of Robert E. Lee? Should this perhaps go into the freezer for a while? And his response was encouraging. He said, no, this is a very humane biography. And he felt that it would do well. And he had talked to a number of people. They agreed this is what we should do going forward. So we did, and the book is there. And I hope, at least to some measure, it speaks for itself as a work of biography, and especially a work about difficult biography.
Professor, I'd like to press on a couple of issues here. And I understand entirely the volatility of the biography of Robert E. Lee, frankly, at almost any time in American history, except for that period in which, to be honest, in the early and mid 20th century in the United States, you had Lee on U.S. postage stamps and some other very interesting developments. But no doubt a very difficult biographical task. But even before we get into Lee's story, and I really look forward to that, you begin, as in this conversation, you asked the question, how do you write the biography of someone who commits treason? Since you began there, both in the book and in this conversation, I have to press that issue just a little bit out of curiosity and a sense of moral weight. Would you define treason?
Well, the Constitution does that task for me, at least in legal and constitutional terms. The Constitution says that treason is giving aid or comfort to the enemies of the United States and making war on the United States. And on both of those counts, it's very difficult for me not to see Robert E. Lee as guilty in terms of what the Constitution describes. That means more than just throwing a heavyweight word around. My father was a career Army officer. He took the oath. My son is an officer in the U.S. Army. He took the oath. I took the oath myself, not in the military, but when I joined the National Council for the Humanities. And so I take that seriously. And when I look at how the Constitution defines treason, it's very difficult for me to see in the conduct of Robert E. Lee something which does not, in fact, conform exactly to those two major points that the Constitution illumines.
The problem in American constitutional law and criminal procedure has been that treason is extremely difficult to prosecute. for one reason, because enemies has been defined as foreign powers. And when it came to the Civil War, it was Lincoln himself who insisted that the South was not a foreign power, but a rebellious part of the United States.
Oh, that's true. And I think with some deliberation on the part of the Constitutional Convention, because look, most of the members of the Constitutional Convention had themselves lived their necks.
Right.
They themselves could, if the revolution had turned out in a different direction, have found themselves guilty of treason. So it's not really too much of a surprise that the designers of the Constitution decided they wanted a very narrow definition of treason. And so it is. And that has made it difficult for treason to be proved.
And just a couple of interesting points here. You went to the American founders and the revolutionaries, and that's where I was going to go to say that under a different set of historical circumstances, someone would say it would be just as difficult to write a biography of George Washington, since he did commit treason and very clearly knew he was committing treason against the king. And the second point I want to make is that my best understanding of the treason charges that would have been brought against the founders was that the treason was not invoked until the Declaration of Independence and the taking off of arms, because refusing to pay taxes was not treason. Denying the power of Parliament was not treason, but denying the sovereignty of King George III, that was treason.
That was treason. And there were many artful ways of defining the defiance of royal sovereignty as treason, short even of a Declaration of Independence. The Lees, of course, were in, so to speak, at the creation, at the very beginnings of the Virginia colony. And for 3 or 4 generations, they are constantly increasing in wealth and their political influence, largely because Thomas Lee, we're talking now the third generation of Lees in Virginia, establishes an alliance with the Fairfax family. And the Fairfaxes were the ones who owned the Great Fairfax Proprietary, which included all of the northern neck of Virginia and extended even all the way to the Shenandoah Valley. So the Lees have acquired quite a position of influence, and they used that in the time of the Revolution. There were 4 Lee brothers who were major figures in the Revolution. Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee were both members of the Continental Congress. And Richard Henry Lee, of course, is the one who puts onto the table the motion for independence in May of 1776, which, of course, was what's going to result in the independence vote and then Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. It's one of the great failures of human nature itself, that we are quite capable, and St. Paul makes this very clear. We are quite capable at looking at what is right, knowing what is right, and then failing to do it, doing the opposite. The Stoics saw that. Euripides talks about seeing the good, doing the evil. What we are looking at is a failure of human nature in Robert E. Lee, and it is a failure. And I don't think that you can quite squirm away from it the way some people try to do by saying, well, Lee did think that slavery was wrong. All right, yes. It's one thing to say that it's wrong, but you have to do something about that. And it was the doing something that he balked at.
So in the end, in your view, Robert E. Lee is a traitor, a great American, in between?
He committed treason. I can't put it any other way. Here's the complicated and conflicted part of Robert E. Lee, and that is he will say in a letter that he writes to his wife in 1856. Slavery is a moral and political evil in any country. He will insist in the years after the war that he pleaded with Jefferson Davis to emancipate the Confederacy's slaves because slavery was a millstone around the Confederacy's neck. And yet at the same time, he is the man commanding armies that are defending slavery, that if he had succeeded, slavery would have been perpetuated.